I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, another massive drone attack on Ukraine. America's ambassador leaves Moscow, and Francis speaks to the founder of the NGO Kiwi K.A.R.E, providing humanitarian aid and evacuations in Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 27th of June, 3 years and 124 days since the full-scale invasion began. First, I summarise the latest military and political developments of the last 24 hours. Ukraine's Air Force said on Friday that it downed 359 out of 363 drones and 6 of 8 missiles launched by Russia overnight. That is up from just 41 drones the previous night. The previous night was, as Francis reported yesterday, probably the quietest night of the air war for some time. But another enormous attack, reflecting that quite significant increase in the number of drones that Russia is able to muster tonight. The Ukrainian Air Force said the attack mainly targeted the small western city of Starokonstantinov, which is home to an important air base. It's frequently targeted by Russian strikes. It said nationwide there were 3 direct hits in 8 areas struck by falling debris. Didn't specify any locations. However, separately, the governor of Dnipropetrovsk region said a Russian missile attack killed 3 people and wounded at least 14 in the city of Samar, which is just northeast of Dnipro itself. This was the second Russian missile attack in that town in the last 3 days. Regional officials gave no immediate details on the damage. On the other side of the line, the Russian Defense Ministry said in a post on Telegram that its air defense units destroyed 39 Ukrainian drones overnight over Russian territory and occupied Crimea. They didn't say how many were launched. The governor of Volgograd region, the southern region just next door to Rostov, which is just across the border from Ukraine, said traffic across the Don River in the Kalachevsky district is temporarily restricted to eliminate wreckage from what he called a massive drone attack overnight. Andrei Bocharov said sappers are at work. He said that there were no injuries as the result of the attack. It's not quite clear what was hit. There is a bridge across the Don there. When he says river traffic, I'm not sure if he's talking about traffic across the bridge or river traffic or both. We do know that Volgograd Airport was closed for 3 hours before flights were restored just before 7 a.m. local time as a result of that attack. Russian authorities also say that Ukrainian drone attack in the Kursk region injured a Chinese war correspondent from the news outlet Phoenix TV. This is from Alexander Kinstein, who is the governor of Kursk region. He said on Telegram, a Ukrainian drone struck the village of Korenovo in the Korenovsky district. A 63-year-old correspondent, Lu Yuguang, who went to the border area on his own, was injured. He said the journalist had skin cuts to his head and after treatment refused hospitalization. Lu himself told Russia's state news agencies that he was feeling fine and wanted to get back to reporting in the Kursk region. I should add that Russia's foreign ministry has called on the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to promptly respond and give a proper assessment of that attack. Moving to the front lines, I'm going to run through in our normal way, working around the kind of clock face of the active front line, starting in the north in what the Ukrainians call the Slobozhansky direction. That's the kind of basically Sumy Oblast. This is the area where Alexander Syrsky, the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, said that the Russian offensive had been halted yesterday. The Center for Defense Strategies, the Ukrainian military independent think tank, said in its update put out late last night that the Russians are still trying to reach a line between the villages of Malakochakivka, Novosich and Marinka. That came after Syrsky said the advance had halted. So they do seem to still be pushing in that area. The fighting not over there at all. Russian troops are also said to have advanced in the northern and western parts of Chansk and attacked near Lipsy. That's an lodgement north of Kharkiv. And then over on the eastern side of Kharkiv region near Kupiansk, Russian troops are trying to advance north and west of a village called Holubivka, which is just straight north of Kupiansk along the Oskil River. They are said to have reached a line about 3.5 kilometers from the northern outskirts of Kupiansk, which, of course, if you haven't been there, Kupiansk essentially sits on top of a ridge which overlooks the Oskil River. Most of the town is on the western side of that river. The Russians have been trying to slowly encircle it for, going on a year at the moment. The Russians also said they captured Nova Kryliakovka, which is south of Kupiansk, in another kind of salient that the Ukrainians hold on the eastern side of the Oskil River. But the Ukrainians have recaptured positions further south from that in a place called Zelyony High, just south of Kupiansk. So a story of back and forth, essentially. Moving south to the Liman area, the Ukrainian forces successfully counterattacked near the village of Rydkodub, and which I've spoken about, last time I was on, which I can't remember how long ago that was, some weeks ago. That's a village at the tip of a very narrow salient the Russians established some weeks ago, and it's a long way from Izum, but if you look on the map, it's driving straight towards the city of Izum. So the Ukrainians pushing back on the tip of that salient. The Russians, however, we have reports they advanced near the villages of Zelena Dolina and Novomikhailivka. That's just a few miles from there. They're on the southern and northern shoulders of that salient. So the Ukrainians blunting the nose, the Russians expanding the shoulders. Very, very slight changes of land we're talking about here. Don't get the impression I'm talking about something dramatic. These are hundreds of meters, if that, as far as we're aware. Further south, the CDS says there are reports that Russian forces are massing near Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, those two occupied cities, for attacks in the Seversk direction. We don't know exactly where that is going to come in or which way they are going to attack, but we do have reports overnight of Russian attacks in several villages in that area. Continued fighting near Chasiv Yar, nothing enormous to report there. But in Terezk, things are a little bit more spicy. The Russians have managed to enter a village near Terezk called Alexandro Kalinova. They were unable to gain a foothold. I'm not sure who holds the village at the moment, but we do have reports that no man's land, what the Ukrainians and the Russians call the grey zone, near Terezk, is getting somewhat larger at the moment. And that is put down to a very large-scale use of Russian fibre-optic UAVs against Ukraine's logistics, which presumably means that they just simply can't manage to be holding the same ground that they were. So a widening of the no man's land between the forces in that area generally. We've also got reports that Russian forces have been delivering supplies using aerial drones in that area. Moving on to Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk now sits basically in the center of a kind of crescent-shaped, shallow Ukrainian salient, if you see what I mean. And the Russians are attacking, or they have been reported to attack over the past couple of days, on both kind of horns of that crescent. So on the western crescent, they advanced overnight near the village of Shevchenkoye and a place called Lysivka. And they've also been reported pushing on the eastern side, the eastern horn of that crescent, as it were, near Malinivka and Mirolubivka. A very, very slight advance, as everyone who's been following the podcast will know very well, that the Russians have been pushing on Pokrovsk for, I'm not even going to try and say how long now. It has been a very, very long-term objective, and the advances there are incremental at best, but you can still see that intention of some kind of attempted encirclement. Then moving further west to Novopavlivka, which is a village on the border of the Donetsk and Dnipro regions. The Russians have captured a village called Yolta. This is a tiny village in the Donetsk region. It's not the city, the resort town on Crimea that you will have heard about or read about, and where Churchill and Roosevelt met Stalin all those years ago. Nonetheless, it has the same name. Ukrainian defense forces then counterattacked. And as far as we're aware, the Ukrainians now control Yolta. Yolta is at the very, very tip of a very, very narrow salient that the Russians have tried to push forward there over the past several days. So again, another example of the Ukrainians blunting the nose of a Russian advance. Further west in the Zaporizhzhia region, we have reports of Russian troops continuing local attacks near Malinivka. And then over on the Oliphant part of the front line, we have reports of attacks near Kamyansk. And that is the village where the front line meets the Dnipro River, so the very western extremity of the active front line. And that concludes more or less military updates for today. Moving on to the diplomatic updates. First, we come to the title of this space, actually. Lynn Tracy, the US ambassador to Russia, is leaving Moscow. This is the US embassy in Moscow announced this morning. Now, this is not entirely unexpected. The embassy kind of trailed that she would be leaving some weeks ago. She has served there since 2022, I think. She served her term, essentially, and she's going home. The thing to note here, I think, is that Lynn Tracy is a career diplomat and she was appointed by Joe Biden. So she's not as American ambassadors often are, which sometimes surprises people from other countries who send professional diplomats to be ambassadors. She is not a political appointee. We don't know who her successor is going to be. Has not been publicly named. I'm sure we'll be looking with great interest at whoever Donald Trump wants to pick for that role. Her outgoing statement, which was posted on social media in Russian by the embassy, she said, "I'm proud to have represented my country in Moscow during such a challenging time. As I leave Russia, I know that my colleagues at the embassy will continue to work to improve our relations and maintain ties with the Russian people." She then quoted Alexander Pushkin's poem To Chadaev. I'm not sure quite why, but anyway, here's a translation. "While we burn with liberty, the while our hearts are quick for honor, my friends, to our land we dedicate the soul's exquisite raptures." It's something about freedom and patriotism in there. The other major diplomatic development today, I think, really comes from Rustem Umerov, the Ukrainian defense minister, who's been speaking, or was speaking last night to journalists in Kyiv, where he said that the Ukrainians' next goal, remember Rustem Umerov has been leading the Ukrainian delegation in peace talks with Russians in Istanbul. He says their next goal is to organize a direct meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin. That is, obviously that strongly symbolizes how far things have come since Volodymyr Zelensky was ruling out any kinds of direct talks with Vladimir Putin. Anyway, speaking to journalists, this is from the Kyiv Independent. Speaking to journalists in Kyiv, Umerov outlined a multi-stage negotiation process that began in January with US President Donald Trump's initiative. He said, "Ukraine has always remained consistent in its pursuit of peace. We support the US initiative for a full ceasefire from the very beginning and demonstrated our commitment through multiple rounds of negotiations. Any dialogue must take place without ultimatums and with full respect to our country's sovereignty." That's fairly boilerplate. The interesting bit, after completing discussions on humanitarian issues, Ukraine plans to move forward to the topic of a leaders' summit for substantive dialogue. They have spoken. Basically, the only progress that's been made in the meeting so far has been on things like prisoner exchanges and the exchange of bodies. So an interesting development there. And I'd note it comes one day after Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, said that his government is working to organize a meeting between Zelensky and Putin, and that he expected Donald Trump would join the talks if they were organized. This is Erdogan speaking yesterday, shortly after he himself met Donald Trump. He said, "If Russian President Vladimir Putin comes to Istanbul or Ankara for a solution, I will also come." That's Erdogan quoting Donald Trump. And then he went on, "We'll hold the necessary contact and, God willing, realize this meeting as soon as possible." That will obviously be, if it happens, one of the most significant moments of the war, if we actually see Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky sitting down opposite one another. You'll remember that we entered this year with a huge amount of expectation and talk and discussion of a potential ceasefire. It hasn't yet materialized. I was speaking to some fairly senior Ukrainian officials in the past week or so who really wanted to emphasize that they're still pushing for this, that the hope is for a ceasefire. So all eyes on that development. Is Erdogan correct? will Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky be sitting down face to face? We shall see. Now, yesterday, you'll have heard my interview with the Latvian Minister of Foreign Affairs. If you didn't hear it, go back and listen to it now. It's great. And all this week, we've given particular focus to European countries who feel most threatened by Russian attacks. But what about those countries further away, where we know many of you listen from? Recently, Francis spoke to Tenby Powell, the founder of the NGO Kiwi K.A.R.E, providing humanitarian aid and evacuations in Ukraine. As you'll hear, they discuss how the war is viewed from the other side of the world and how, despite the distance, many thousands of people from New Zealand and elsewhere are helping Ukraine. Francis has also entered the following line in the script. For the record, Dom, this is what a New Zealand accent really sounds like.
Well, Tenby, thank you very much for your time. I know it's a very early start there where you are in New Zealand. It's about 7 p.m. here and 6 a.m. there, so we do very much appreciate it. And actually, it's with New Zealand that I'd like to start, if I may. I know we have many, many listeners in New Zealand, and we hugely appreciate it. And I think it's a constant source of frustration for all of us that we can't talk about New Zealand more, given how many listeners we have there. But Tenby, if I could just start by asking you, what is the average New Zealander's perspective on the war in Ukraine? What stories catch your eye over there?
Oh, well, good evening, Francis. It's just a great privilege to be on Ukraine, the latest with you, and my congratulations to you, Dominic, and the team for having done such an incredible job these past 3 years and over 2 months now. It's just incredible. We in New Zealand, as you know, are half a world away from Ukraine. And I guess, notwithstanding that, there is extraordinary support by both the New Zealand government, in so much as we can do, and by the public. And I think exemplified by the support that Kiwi K.A.R.E, Kiwi Aid and refugee evacuation has had by way of financial contribution to our humanitarian efforts in Ukraine, particularly. And I think from a New Zealand perspective, and this is kind of who we are, acknowledging the faces behind the figures has an ability to foster empathy and understanding. And this is critically important to us as Kiwis, reminding ourselves that every number is a heartbeat and a life. And as a consequence of that, we've had great success in raising both awareness and raising funds for our humanitarian and medical aid efforts in Ukraine these past 3 years. And we are 3. Kiwi K.A.R.E is 3 in May.
Well, congratulations to you, and we'll talk a little bit more about your organisation shortly. But I wonder if I could ask, first of all, the perspective on the big stories that get cut through in New Zealand, whether it be stories relating perhaps more to China, to Trump's America. What are the stories that perhaps are related in some way to Ukraine and the way that the war in Ukraine is perhaps realigning the global order that are of relevance, particularly to Kiwis?
Well, look, I think there's two bits to this, really. One is the absolute injustice of what's happening. And the situation surrounding Ukraine's border is a stark example of geopolitical injustice, not really just since February 22, but more since February 2014. And again, Kiwis are used to being the little guy on the block, and we don't like to see little guys beaten up. And I don't mean to be glib, but there is a lot of that going into the support that we are providing to Ukraine, whether it's at government level or, in our case, private level. There is no doubt that the Trump effect has amplified the support. And I know when Trump was re-elected, we had very significant donations across a period of about a month to 6 weeks. Now, what I discovered also in Ukraine exactly at the same time was requests exponentiated for humanitarian and medical aid. Now, whether that was a perceived problem about to eventuate or whether it was a real problem, I can't work out. There is no doubt that there was a real problem with the turning off of American military aid. There's no doubt about that. I wasn't aware that there was so much a turning off the tap of humanitarian aid, but certainly we were working literally 24/7 across that period. I have to say it's calmed down a little bit now, and our teams are working constantly anyway. There is really no more capacity for us. But the Trump effect, I think his re-election has had a very significant impact on our view of the world, as it should do. I mean, we're a very small trading nation, and the impact of, or the imposition of tariffs and the impact on a very small country like New Zealand, which is critically export-oriented, is very worrying, particularly for small business here in New Zealand.
That's very interesting. And of course, it will resonate with listeners that we have in Australia and Canada and many, many other places. So thank you for that. Let's go back in time then to the full-scale invasion and tell me how you reacted at that time, Tenby, and how you then got involved in the organisation that you now are doing so much work. I mean, there's so many different aspects of this, but take me back to that time.
Well, I guess like many Francis sitting watching television in February 2022, I was aghast, absolutely shocked at what was happening. I mean, this is not supposed to happen. And all the post-World War II structures that had been created that would give us a semblance of a rules-based order for how we conduct ourselves in the world were being thrown to the four winds. And it was my belief then, and absolutely now, and exacerbated by Trump's re-election, is that this war has the potential to change the world order as we know it. I thought that in 2022, and gave speeches about that when we first started raising funds for Kiwi K.A.R.E. That has absolutely been borne out to be true. We've seen realliances, and of course we're going to see future trade realliances that will, I think be very, very different to those which have existed before in some cases. But from a Ukraine point of view particularly, the shift in power dynamics, the security that has been so critically important was just really getting thrown to the four winds. And I just couldn't sit there, given my background, and do nothing. And I just felt that there was an opportunity to get stuck in and just do as much as I could with a small team that had yet to be developed. Now, the history to this is a chap that I was in the New Zealand Army with who had been in Poland for some time, was married to a Polish woman. He and his family lived in Warsaw, and he introduced me to a wonderful Brit guy, ex-British Foreign Service, who is now a very successful businessman in not just Poland, but Eastern Europe. And his name is Guy. Guy and I become very good mates, but Guy was instrumental in introducing me to a lot of people. And he said to me, look, they were moving hundreds of tons of humanitarian aid through his business. And they had, as he described it, blitzkrieg fatigue. They were just so exhausted in those early weeks and months of the war. And they were also running out of money to be able to move stuff. And he said to me, come across and help me with what he described as strategic fundraising, which I did. My wife could see my mounting frustration, and so gave me a pass to go for a few months. The inevitable happened. An Australian team had one of their members ill and just simply asked if I could help take a van into Ukraine and do some deliveries. I recall across that time, which would have been no more than 4 weeks really, traveling across to Kiev, down to Odessa, which in those days, this is mid-ish or early 2022, was pretty benign in Odessa. Across to Mykolaiv, east to Mykolaiv, which was still in those days under artillery fire, up through Zaporizhia to Kharkiv, which was really tricky. And then back, I just had this burning desire, having seen the immense humanitarian need to create a New Zealand flagged operation. And the rest is history. Here we are 1 hour, 3 years later.
Yeah, and the work that your organisation have done is pretty extraordinary. You've evacuated over 3,000 civilians. You've fabricated over 4,500 stoves and water boilers, distributed 300 generators. I mean, the list just goes on. I'm just giving a very short summary here, and ambulances as well. What has been the most valuable work that you think you've contributed to in terms of, because there are so many organisations, of course, who are doing valuable work in Ukraine, but what are you particularly proud of?
Look, that's absolutely right. And it's very important to acknowledge all those that are doing this work, and many acting in a volunteer capacity, as indeed we are. I think, Francis, there's two things here. One is, the positive impact that we've had on humans. And it's not just the evacuations, and many of those in that number are patient transfers to and from hospitals. And it's important to, I think, remember that the access that we had in the early days to the previously occupied areas showed that there had been not just ill treatment, but the Ukrainians who were living under Russian control at that time were given nothing by way of their basic needs weren't being met. And so some of the medical problems that we faced when we first arrived were pretty horrific, really. And just being able to bring a human touch to this by providing the necessities of life was extraordinary in those early days. That remains fantastic. Out of that knowledge, of course, came the fabrication of stoves and water boilers, and they're all made out of recycled electrical water cylinders, as we would call them in our countries. So it's a recycling project, very practical, pretty agricultural, but very effective. And so we learned a lot about how to really reach out and touch people in a very practical way with life-saving humanitarian impacts of various natures. The other thing I'm proud of is our partnership with Ukrainian organisations. So across this period of time, we've moved purposefully from having international volunteers en masse to handing over the responsibility for this to Ukrainians. And that remains extremely important to us. So our success through partnership model ensures mission success. And we've handed it over to the Ukrainians who understand the needs, who are highly motivated to ensure that their countrymen and women, many of whom are elderly or children, by the way, as you can understand, are looked after in a way which is perhaps lost on occasion by international volunteers. And so in so doing, this level of humanitarian diplomacy that we've been engaged in for 3 years now has been very effective.
Yeah, and I think we've obviously spoken to many organisations and charities over the years. And of course, one of the major challenges for them, and I'm sure for you, is making sure that you get what you can provide to the places that need it most. And I know that you've got a particular model which you adopt, and that might well be of interest to other organisations, because perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I use a trucking company term or a logistics term. We are a last mile deliverer. And look, I'll be honest about why that has transpired, because there was a time when we used third-party warehouses and what have you. We don't anymore because humanitarian aid was stolen. Now, I'm not suggesting that it was necessarily stolen by Ukrainians, although there have been some reports of that. But any large-scale war of this sort is chaotic, and it can attract chaotic people to it who are there for not necessarily the right reasons. And we saw evidence of that, particularly in 2022. Where there was theft of humanitarian aid, there's been trafficking of women, there's been all sorts of crime committed that I think the humanitarian organisations, and I hope the world, are very aware of today. So while it took us a month or two to cut the wheat from the chaff, we absolutely got there really quickly, and hence this strategic pivot, if you will, to start passing over responsibility to bona fide Ukrainian NGOs, registered NGOs. And that's worked brilliantly. But we decided more than that we wanted to identify through a range of sources those that do need, to your point, humanitarian and medical aid the most, and put it directly into their hands. And indeed, we have had great support in being able to identify those people. And a lot of it has been through the military, who are able to operate outside of curfews, and they operate ambulances. We've taken 35 ambulances from New Zealand and Australia to Ukraine, and the vast majority of those have been donated to hospitals, medical centres, frontline medical units, and being able to identify those in great need who have remained in situ, despite the fact that it's a very harsh environment and very dangerous environment in which to live, has been hugely beneficial to know where we need to put the aid that we get.
Thank you. That's really very insightful, and I'm sure that will be of interest to many organisations and charities who listen to Ukraine the Latest. I wonder if you can talk a little further about the planning for the long term, because of course so much of your work, I imagine, like many others, is prioritising that month, the next trip, the next delivery. How do you plan longer term? Because of course this is something that I think many of us feel still has a long way to go. How do you factor that into your plans, particularly because you rely on donations? Is this something that you have to bank, or are you just taking each month as it comes, really?
No, we do plan ahead, and you're absolutely right. Donations are the lifeblood. It keeps the wheels of humanitarian aid rolling. But we have a number of initiatives. I mean, we've got some really big ones that we're hoping to talk to government about at some stage, none the least of which is building projects, if you will, tiny houses We've been asked to do that on a number of occasions. We haven't quite cracked that either financially or in terms of the right model yet, but we are really keen to be engaged in this wider and more strategic humanitarian impact. And a lot of that is ensuring that people aren't living in refugee centres for too long, or indeed are able to come back from overseas, from other countries if they are living outside of Ukraine. And so there's a range of things that we do, but at the moment, the core processes for us are what we call Road of Life, which is the evacuations, the medical aid going forward, and the management of ambulances. We've got our own fleet of ambulances under that banner. The manufacturing of or fabrication of water boilers and stoves, this is absolutely critical. And not just through the winter months, as we've now discovered in the last year or so, but all year round because of the continual strikes on power and infrastructure. So they're necessary all the time. And we've got a team of, last count, 10 Ukrainian fabricators in a very small workshop in Kiev. And they do an absolutely stunning job stripping these things down and rebuilding them as viable entities. And of course, just the general supply of humanitarian and medical aid, which is just never ending, Francis. And it is Groundhog Day. There's nothing glamorous about this remotely. It's just continually goes on and on and on. We're at a stage now where I get messages from civic leaders like mayors of communities or towns or cities, right through to the clergy and even in some cases the military on WhatsApp and Signal saying, can you please help this particular community that we've identified in an area who are desperate for humanitarian aid, and for whatever reason the big aid agencies don't go there, and we're very happy to go there and do what we can to help.
And we've reported on those cases ourselves on the podcast. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your plans for July. I know you're going to be going over there next. That's the next big project, because it takes time to plan these, and then you're going over there yourself for some time. What's your priorities for this trip?
Well, when I started going over, it was important, I think, to make sure that we had, particularly with the Ukrainians, we were one team. And indeed, we are now in terms of operational planning and its conduct. We are very much one team. My responsibility is more today around fundraising to keep those wheels of humanitarian aid rolling. But when I do go back, I want to ensure the guys are safe, and they don't have a military background in any regard. And I want to make sure that we are not taking risks that over and above the call, if you will. There's been a number of humanitarian aid workers killed, and some of it is just plain bad luck. And that can happen in environments like this. Every life lost is tragic. And what we try and do is plan as much as we can based on the level of intelligence that we can garner to make sure that when we do go into an area, we're going in under the right conditions. That doesn't always work, Francis, I have to say. And there's been times when we've been smacked pretty hard in some of the places that we've gone, and we don't have protected vehicles in any regards. Well, we've got Mercedes Sprinters vans and Toyota Crafter vans and what have you, and a big old truck, like many of the aid agencies do. But what we don't do is we don't have forward operating bases that are static, so we keep moving. And we make sure that we have the ability to be fleet of foot, agile in both our movement and our thinking, and be able to move in and deliver the aid as effectively and as expediently as we can, conduct whatever evacuations are needed, and then we tend to get out of there. So we don't have forward operating bases that are well forward, well known, and well marked by the Russians. And very sadly, of course, we know that the Red Cross was hit not so long ago in and around Konstantinivka, I think it was, if my memory serves me, and they lost a number of people, a B train full of humanitarian aid. So our model is very different. We like to think that we've got the ability to be agile in every regard and just move as quickly as we can where things are needed, when they're needed.
Well, I know many listeners will be very interested in learning more, and we'll have a link in the description for those who wish to learn more about your work and the way that you approach this, and perhaps even support you. Just going back out and zooming out, of course, we were speaking at the beginning about New Zealand's perspective on this war, and I'm putting you on the spot here a bit, Tenby, but what would your message be to listeners around the world? Because, as I say, we haven't had many people on the podcast over the months or years from New Zealand. What would your message be to them about your country's approach to this war and why it matters?
Well, it's not so much New Zealand's approach. I mean, I'm very heartened by Prime Minister Christopher Luxon, our Prime Minister here in New Zealand, and his government and the support they've given Ukraine. I mean, look, we're a tiny country, Francis, as you know, but I think we've done some great things. We've had 2 New Zealanders killed fighting for the Ukrainian International Legion and 1 humanitarian aid worker. And I hope that's the end of that, because we are making a contribution that New Zealand often does in far off lands. The message I've got is to anyone who's listening is really twofold. Do not, under any circumstances, give up on Ukraine. I give speeches all around New Zealand and some in Australia, and I open with a comment that simply says, Ukraine have the ability to win this war. I truly believe this, and I ask you to hold that belief too. And I say that because I really do hope the Europeans understand what the Ukrainians have achieved these past 3+ years. They have held back the Russian army. Not only held them back, but they conducted in late 2022, early 23, the most extraordinary of counteroffensives, and pushed the Russians back so significantly and they really haven't made much impact since. And I know that the Russian propaganda machine is in full swing on the wins that they're making. But let's not forget the incredible tract of land that Ukraine took back as part of their counteroffensive. The operation in Kursk is quite extraordinary. And again, the propaganda machine would suggest that they're getting booted out of Kursk, not to the knowledge that we've got. In fact, they might have slipped back a bit, and that may be quite purposeful. But they've held ground for many, many months now. And the other part of that, of course, is the destruction of some 50% of the Black Sea fleet, mostly using maritime drones and what have you. I mean, really quite an extraordinary, multi-pronged counteroffensive, defensive, and then offensive operations that the Ukrainian military have mounted. If they're given the right support, and this is my key message, they will win this war. And the other part of that, really, Francis, and I know that your focus with the podcast has been on this, is that if it's not a just peace, it's not going to be a sustainable peace. And while it's great that President Trump, on the one hand, is saying he doesn't want to see anyone killed, I mean, to those of us that are looking at this objectively, it does seem that the deal for peace with Ukraine hinges very much around the economics of the rare minerals, more than it does around life-preserving and therefore a just peace. And many of the people that I talk to and around the world would like to see not only a just peace, but as part of that, the re-establishment of the 2014 borders. Very, very difficult to do. We understand how that would be a real hard nut to crack. But I go back to 2022-23, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive was lightning fast and worked extremely well. And one of the principles of war when on the attack, and this really was an attack, we call it a counteroffensive, but it was an attack to move the enemy out of the way, and it was a rout at that point. One of the principles of war that are critical to this is to maintain the momentum. And if I look back at the time when Speaker Mike Johnson was appointed, and that long period of filibustering, he would not have the debate on whether or not to continue the funding. Across that period and a bit later, the defensive posture that the Russians were able to adopt by the Ukrainians not being able to maintain that momentum was extraordinary. And now it will be a hard nut to crack to get up and go again. But I would maintain that the Ukrainians have every ability to win this war. And more than that, Francis, there's got to be a culminating point for Russia coming very soon. I mean, that not just militarily, they've lost, over 800,000 troops. They've lost material, tanks and ships and artillery pieces and craft, the likes of which we haven't seen before. And the sanctions must be biting. The cost of this war must be biting them economically. So my message is really to the Europeans to say, if Ukraine can do this pretty much by themselves, imagine what they could do with your combined help and to get up and really do this. Because at the end of the day, I think we all know that Ukraine is the only dam preventing Russian imperialistic expansion into not just Eastern Europe, but potentially into the West as well.
Well, Tenby, I wish I had your articulacy at 6 a.m. in the morning. Very envious of your eloquence. So thank you very much for your time today. And as ever with our guests, borrowing David's question, is there anything that's on your mind that should be on ours that we've not talked about?
Well, no, I just want to thank you and all the team for your incredible work. Ukraine the Latest, I would recommend to everybody and have done to many. If you want an update, it's incredible, really, the updates that you do bring. And I just look forward to continuing to listen and support you and just thank you all so much.
Francis Dearnley there speaking to Tenby Powell of the NGO Kiwi K.A.R.E. That's all for Ukraine the Latest today. Your usual team of Dom, Francis and Adelie will be back with you on Monday. Until then, goodbye.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.